Let's play a little game, shall we? Imagine you wake up one morning in medieval Europe. The birds are chirping, the distant church bell is ringing, your stomach growling, breakfast time. But here's the catch. You're not grabbing your oat milk latte and a croissant from your favorite overpriced coffee shop. No, you're about to face the beautiful, slightly horrifying, and occasionally fatal world of medieval food. A world where chefs doubled as poison testers, where dinner could be anything from a hearty stew to, well, fermented shark, where the concept of organic was less a trendy hashtag and more a desperate hope that your bread wasn't secretly made of sawdust. See, back then, food wasn't just something you casually Instagram before taking your first bite. Food was power. Food was status. Food was, sometimes, a terrifying gamble with your intestines. Royal banquets could easily double as episodes of Game of Thrones. Peasants? They were just hoping their porridge didn't come with extra protein in the form of weevils. And let's not forget the accidental food poisoning that swept entire towns like a medieval version of bad Yelp reviews. In today's journey, we'll gently stroll, at a very safe distance, through the bizarre, hilarious, and occasionally disturbing culinary landscape of the Middle Ages. We'll explore why nobles ate things that would make Gordon Ramsay cry, why peasants basically invented farm to table centuries before it was cool, and why spices were basically more valuable than Bitcoin. Yes, seriously. So grab your wooden spoon, maybe hold your breath, and let's dine like it's 1347. Let's set the table, quite literally. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food. It was a billboard, a flex, a loud, edible statement screaming, "Look at me, I'm rich, important, and probably have better digestion than you." Every single meal was an opportunity to show off, especially if you were part of the upper crust, which coincidentally was also the only part of the bread nobles bothered to eat. For kings, dukes, and wealthy merchants, hosting a feast was basically the medieval version of throwing a yacht party in Monaco. Except instead of champagne, you had honeymead. And instead of a private DJ, you had a half-drunk bard playing the lute while a jester tried very hard not to get executed for a bad joke. But while the music played and the meat roasted, there was always an underlying tension, because in medieval dining, danger lurked under every silver platter. Food could be a weapon. Rivals slipped poisons into goblets. Ambitious courtiers plotted over platters of stuffed swan. And if you were the host, well, better have a royal food taster handy, preferably one you didn't like very much. You see, in an era where personal hygiene was, let's politely say, experimental, even a properly cooked meal could turn on you. Undercooked meat, that's a surprise invitation to medieval salmonella. Unpasteurized milk, hope you enjoy several hours of intestinal regret. Moldy bread? Congratulations, you may have just invented LSD, accidentally. Of course, none of this really bothered the nobles. Why? Because if they got sick, they simply summoned a physician who might bleed them or suggest leeches. Problem solved. Meanwhile, the poor? They didn't worry about poison. They couldn't afford food fancy enough to be poisoned. Their main concern was simply getting enough of it. Barley gruel, cabbage soup, occasional scraps of cheese, if the local lord was feeling generous, or distracted. Meat? A rare holiday miracle. For the peasantry, every meal was essentially a delicate negotiation between survival and scurvy. But don't feel too sorry for them just yet, because while the nobles played their high-stakes dinner games, the peasants were accidentally living closer to what we now call a whole foods, plant-based diet. Ironically, that barley gruel might have been better for you than half the monstrosities served at the king's table. But we're just getting started, because if you think strange birds and questionable bread were the worst of it, oh no. The medieval menu has plenty more surprises. Up next, what did the peasants actually eat? And how many ways can you cook barley before losing your will to live? Stay with me. Let's leave the castles for a moment, because while kings were busy stabbing each other with tiny forks over swan legs, most people were not debating which wine paired better with roasted hedgehog. They were just trying not to starve. For your average medieval peasant, the culinary experience was repetitive. Think of it as a never-ending, all-you-can-eat barley buffet, except no one actually wanted seconds. Barley porridge for breakfast, barley bread for lunch, barley soup for dinner, and, if they were feeling wild, barley pancakes. You get the theme. Now, to spice up this thrilling menu, peasants relied heavily on cabbage. Cabbage was the true medieval MVP. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and frankly, it could survive nuclear winter. If kale is the modern health influencer's darling, cabbage was the medieval superfood, though without the Instagram filters. Add in a few turnips, some onions, maybe a sad carrot, and you had yourself a solid stew. Was it exciting? Not remotely. Was it filling? Absolutely. Meat, on the other hand, was about as common as a dragon sighting. Most peasants might see pork or chicken only on special feast days or after a very unlucky pig. For protein, they often turned to beans, lentils, or, depending on how desperate things got, insects. Yes, bugs. Not exactly Michelin-starred, but hey, plenty of iron. And let's not forget dairy. Milk, butter, and cheese were part of the diet, when the cows cooperated and weren't stolen by neighboring lords or angry bandits. But even then, fresh milk spoiled quickly, which meant most of it was turned into cheese or buttermilk. And no, there were no cute little charcuterie boards involved. As for beverages, well, water was suspicious. Between the sewage, dead fish, and general mystery substances floating around, you'd need nerves of steel to drink it. So, they drank ale. All day, every day, even the children. Of course, medieval ale wasn't the heavy IPA that modern hipsters sip while debating beard oils. It was much weaker, closer to liquid bread, and safer than the local well. Basically, hydration with a buzz. And now, for dessert. Just kidding. There usually wasn't any. Sugar was a rare and expensive luxury, imported from faraway lands and hoarded by the elite. If peasants wanted something sweet, they'd turn to honey. If they were lucky enough to have bees that hadn't mysteriously vanished. But let's not paint this entirely as misery. Peasant food, while simple, was often locally sourced, minimally processed, and organic, mostly because they didn't have any other option. In modern wellness circles, they'd be praised for their sustainable diets, intermittent fasting, and farm-to-table lifestyle. Without realizing it, medieval peasants were way ahead of Goop. Still, let's not romanticize it too much, because as we'll see next, while peasants had their barley and cabbage, the nobles were over there turning dinner into full-blown theatrical productions, with dishes so absurd you'll wonder if anyone actually enjoyed eating them. We're entering the world of roasted peacocks, pies with live birds, and culinary stunts that make modern molecular gastronomy look tame. Brace yourself. Now, let's step back inside the castle. Because while peasants were busy mastering the art of barley fatigue, the nobles had other ideas. Big, loud, ridiculous ideas. For medieval royalty, dinner wasn't just about eating. It was a spectacle, an event, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, power, and, quite frankly, extremely questionable culinary decisions. Hosting a feast was the ultimate status symbol. It was how you impressed foreign dignitaries, intimidated rivals, and reminded your guests that you could afford to serve things no sane person would ever consider putting in their mouth. And what exactly did they serve? Let's start with the birds. Peacock, for example. Not because it tasted particularly good, it didn't, but because it looked fabulous on the table. After roasting, the cooks would painstakingly reattach the bright feathers to make it appear as though the bird had casually decided to lie down and die in the most glamorous way possible. Because nothing says royal dining quite like eating something that looks like it's still judging you. But peacock was just the beginning. There were swans, cranes, herons. Basically, if it had wings and was remotely exotic, it was fair game for the medieval roasting spit. And then there was the infamous 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. Yes, that nursery rhyme was inspired by real medieval dishes. Large pies were sometimes served with live birds hidden inside, so when the crust was cut open, the birds would fly out, flapping around the dining hall in chaotic glory. It was dinner and entertainment rolled into one, a sort of early interactive dinner theater, complete with avian panic. Of course, nobles didn't stop at birds. They enjoyed elaborate centerpieces called subtleties, grand displays made of sugar, marzipan, or molded pastry that depicted castles, ships, mythical creatures, or whatever else screamed, "I have way too much money." And while your modern dinner guests might enjoy a polite salad to start, medieval nobles preferred entire roasted boars, complete with gilded tusks and sometimes, because subtlety wasn't really their thing, gold leaf applied to the skin. Yes, they literally ate gold, not because it was healthy, but because they could. Now let's pause here for a moment and acknowledge something important. Much of this food wasn't particularly tasty. Medieval cooking techniques involved lots of boiling, heavy spices to cover up questionable freshness, and the occasional "just cook it until it's dead again" philosophy. But flavor wasn't the point. The point was that you were rich enough to serve absurd things. Exotic spices from the East, rare animals from distant lands, sugar sculptures that cost more than your neighbor's entire estate. And the guests? They would nod, applaud politely, and pretend to enjoy the gilded peacock while secretly praying for something less chewy. These feasts could last for hours, sometimes days, course after course after course, meat after meat after meat, interspersed with musical performances, dancing, poetry readings, and occasionally a bit of jousting. Because why not? And hovering in the background, always, was the quiet dread of food poisoning. Because even at these grand affairs, basic food safety was more of a suggestion than a rule. So while the nobles feasted like gods, they also employed entire teams of food tasters, just in case someone slipped a little extra seasoning into the stew, because nothing ruins a good party like an unexpected assassination. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Because while the nobles played culinary Russian roulette, there was another valuable commodity quietly transforming the entire dining experience: spices. Exotic, expensive, and occasionally more valuable than gold itself. And in our next chapter, we'll explore how pepper, cinnamon, and a few other innocent-looking powders became the true currency of medieval power. Stick around. If you've ever felt bad about spending $8 on a tiny jar of pink Himalayan salt, don't. In the Middle Ages, that would have been considered an absolute bargain. Because spices? They were the Bitcoin of medieval Europe, only slightly more stable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These unassuming little powders were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. Merchants risked their lives crossing oceans, deserts, and treacherous mountain passes to bring spices from India, the Spice Islands, and the Middle East back to Europe. And when they arrived, they cashed in. A single sack of pepper could buy you a decent house. A few pounds of cinnamon might cover your daughter's dowry. Nutmeg? Let's just say wars were fought over nutmeg. And what did people do with these precious goods once they finally landed in Europe? Mostly they dumped them on absolutely everything. Did your meat taste questionable? Add pepper. Was your fish a little too fishy? Add cloves. Bread going stale? Sprinkle some cinnamon. In many ways, medieval cooks were the original inventors of just add more seasoning and pray. The thing is, most of the meat and fish served at noble banquets wasn't exactly fresh. Refrigeration didn't exist. Preservation methods were ambitious at best. Salt curing, smoking, pickling, all helpful, but far from perfect. So, when the venison started to smell a bit adventurous, the chef reached for the spice rack. A heavy hand with the cinnamon might not save the meat, but at least it would confuse your taste buds long enough to choke it down politely. And yes, before you ask, they also used spices in desserts. A lot. Because sugar itself was still absurdly expensive, and sweetening things often meant combining what little sugar you had with spices to create elaborate, heavily flavored concoctions. To the medieval palate, a ginger saffron almond sugar pie wasn't strange. It was a delicacy. Of course, for the average peasant, all of this was purely theoretical. They couldn't afford spices. Their entire spice rack might contain one sad bunch of wild garlic, or, if they were lucky, a handful of mustard seeds. The spice trade also had some unintended side effects, like triggering global exploration, accidental discoveries of continents, and the occasional minor colonial empire. Because when Europeans realized just how insanely profitable the spice market was, they went absolutely feral trying to control it. Entire expeditions were launched with the sole purpose of finding faster, cheaper routes to the source. Some succeeded. Some got hopelessly lost and bumped into the Americas by mistake, all for the chance to dump a little more nutmeg into their questionable mutton stew. And let's not forget that spices weren't just for taste. Oh no, they were medicine too. In medieval thinking, everything you ate influenced your bodily humors. Too much cold, add warming spices. Too much dry, moisten it up with ginger syrup. Every bite was basically an early version of clean eating. Except instead of wellness bloggers, you had monks with questionable medical training. But make no mistake, spices were serious business. Wars were fought, kingdoms rose and fell, all so that some nervous noble could confidently drown his slightly spoiled roast beef in a tidal wave of pepper. And next, speaking of slightly spoiled, we're about to enter one of the most charmingly horrifying corners of medieval cuisine. The dishes modern people would absolutely refuse to eat, even on a dare. Fermented, rotten, curdled, congealed, medieval food was many things. Appetizing was not always one of them. Stay with me. It only gets weirder from here. All right, now we're entering the part of the medieval cookbook that modern chefs would describe as, please don't try this at home. Because while the nobles were busy setting live birds loose from pies, and the peasants were mastering cabbage 47 different ways, there was a whole category of medieval dishes that can only be described as brave. Let's begin with fermented fish, always a crowd favorite, if the crowd consists entirely of people with no functioning sense of smell. In certain northern regions, folks developed the charming habit of preserving fish by letting it rot slightly, sometimes burying it underground for good measure. Because nothing says bon appetit like unearthing your dinner. If you're imagining something similar to modern Scandinavian surströmming, congratulations. That's about as close as we get to medieval culinary horror in modern times. Open the jar, and your neighbors may file a complaint. But wait, fish wasn't the only candidate for creative fermentation. Medieval folks also experimented with curdled milk products that might politely be described as aggressively aged. Cheese, of course, was a common and practical way to preserve milk. But sometimes things went a little further. There were curds that hardened into rock-like wheels, soft cheeses that oozed ominously, and varieties so pungent that modern cheese snobs would start reconsidering their life choices. And then there was blood, because when meat was scarce, people got creative. Blood pudding, blood sausages, and blood pancakes were all very much on the menu. It's efficient, really. Why waste a single drop of the animal when you can stir it into your breakfast? And before you cringe too hard, remember, some of these dishes still exist. Black pudding remains a beloved part of certain traditional English breakfasts, though, mercifully, nowadays it comes with less fear of accidental dysentery. But perhaps one of the most questionable ingredients regularly consumed in medieval times was something called salad oil. Think of it as an early version of cooking oil made from rendered animal fats, sometimes mixed with herbs, sometimes just very old. Freshness was optional, flavor was an accident. And for dessert? Well, assuming anyone survived the first several courses, you might be treated to something like leech, a medieval jelly made from almond milk, sugar, and, depending on the recipe, rosewater or random spices thrown in for fun. Sometimes it wobbled, sometimes it didn't. The suspense was half the entertainment. And let's not forget about medieval candies. Sugar, as you know, was ludicrously expensive, so candied fruits, sugared nuts, and marzipan sculptures were reserved for the one-percenters. These weren't simply treats, they were power flexes. Presenting your guests with a marzipan model of your own castle? That was the medieval equivalent of driving a gold-plated Lamborghini to brunch. But while nobles enjoyed their elaborate, questionably edible sugar monuments, peasants found joy in simpler things, like honey cakes, spiced bread, or, if luck struck, an apple that hadn't yet been claimed by worms. The truth is, many of these bizarre dishes weren't created because people particularly enjoyed them. They were born out of necessity, superstition, and a complete lack of refrigeration. Food preservation was always a gamble. Salt, smoke, vinegar, and fermentation were their tools, and occasionally their undoing. Yet, despite the odds, people kept experimenting. Sometimes they stumbled upon recipes that endured for centuries. Other times, they created dishes that even the most adventurous modern foodies would politely decline. But as weird as these medieval recipes sound, they were about survival, resourcefulness, and sometimes, let's be honest, a little bit of culinary masochism. And speaking of survival, next we venture into the darker side of medieval dining, the not-so-subtle art of poisoning. Because sometimes it wasn't the spoiled meat you had to worry about. It was the person sitting across the table. Stay with me. The plot thickens, and so does the gravy. Let's be honest, when most people today worry about food safety, they're thinking about expiration dates, salmonella, or whether that sushi place looks a bit too empty on a Friday night. But in the Middle Ages, food safety had a slightly more sinister meaning, because sometimes the thing trying to kill you wasn't bacteria. It was the chef, or the butler, or your cousin who really wanted your castle. Poisoning was the medieval power move, the silent assassin hiding in your wine goblet, the invisible dagger served with your roast goose. And because so much of medieval politics revolved around banquets, dinners, and elaborate feasts, food quickly became both nourishment and weapon. If you were a noble, attending a fancy banquet was not simply a night of overeating and regretting your fashion choices. It was a test of trust, or lack thereof. Enter the food taster, the unsung hero of medieval dining, a man whose entire job description was, "Eat this first and let's see if you die." If the taster slumped over mid-meal, well, problem identified. If he survived, bon appetit, Your Majesty. It wasn't exactly a dream job. The pay was decent. The benefits were highly variable. But food tasters weren't just there for the obvious poisons. Many deadly substances of the time were slow-acting, odorless, or disguised within the heavy spices and sauces so popular at court. That roast pheasant might contain arsenic. The honey cake? A pinch of powdered deadly nightshade. Even the wine, so essential to these feasts, could be tainted with crushed gemstones or lead-based concoctions that promised a slow and elegant decline. And here's the best part. Because science was still finding its footing, some people genuinely believed certain poisons worked better depending on the victim's mood, diet, or even astrology chart. Yes, they checked the stars before slipping something into your soup. But poisons weren't always used to kill. Sometimes they were deployed to weaken. A little stomach upset before a crucial meeting. A slow drain on your rival's health to make him seem weak and unfit to rule. A subtle nudge in the direction of abdication. It was politics with seasoning. Of course, it wasn't just humans who had to worry. Royal pets, prized hunting falcons, even horses were sometimes targeted as collateral damage, because destabilizing a king's household could start with more than just the king himself. Naturally, this led to a kind of medieval arms race in antidotes. Monks, alchemists, and court physicians brewed up elaborate universal antidotes, complicated mixtures of herbs, minerals, and occasionally downright bizarre ingredients like crushed pearls, powdered coral, or bits of preserved viper. Some antidotes included over 50 ingredients. Did they work? Well, let's just say that if you were lucky, the antidote didn't kill you faster than the poison. And while all this high-stakes culinary sabotage unfolded among the elites, peasants, once again, mostly avoided the drama. Nobody poisoned the guy eating turnip soup, because there was nothing to gain by assassinating a man whose biggest asset was half a goat and some barley. But at the royal level, dinner was never just dinner. It was a battlefield dressed up as a buffet. And the paranoia didn't stop at the dining table. Silver goblets were believed to change color in the presence of poison. Gem-encrusted rings sometimes contained secret compartments for emergency antidotes. Even table salt was occasionally blessed by priests before meals, just to cover all spiritual bases. But despite all these precautions, people still died, quietly, mysteriously, and often over dessert. Because in the Middle Ages, the kitchen was every bit as dangerous as the battlefield. And speaking of dangerous, next we'll explore how deeply the fear of evil spirits and bad omens shaped medieval cooking. Because sometimes your biggest threat wasn't your cousin's poisoned pie, it was the angry ghost watching you eat it. Stay with me. The superstition course is about to be served. Now, if you thought medieval cooks only had to worry about food spoilage and poison plots, you're giving them way too much credit. Because cooking in the Middle Ages also meant wrestling with the unseen forces of the universe. You weren't just making soup. You were battling demons, warding off curses, and hoping your bread wouldn't attract the evil eye. Superstition was baked into nearly every aspect of medieval life. And the kitchen was no exception. For starters, many believed certain foods had intrinsic, mystical properties. Garlic, for example, wasn't just delicious. It was a full-time bodyguard against evil spirits, vampires, and pretty much any supernatural creature that might casually wander into your hut. Salt? Oh, salt was serious business. Spilling it was practically inviting the devil for tea. To counteract such bad luck, people developed elaborate rituals, tossing the spilled salt over your left shoulder to blind the lurking demon behind you. Because obviously medieval demons were easily distracted by sodium projectiles. Eggs held special significance too. Breaking an egg improperly could let evil spirits slip into your kitchen. Some even poked holes in both ends of the eggshell to prevent witches from using the empty shells as little boats for magical mischief. Yes, witches allegedly sailed tiny eggshell boats across puddles to cast spells. It was an oddly specific fear. And speaking of witches, they were everywhere. At least according to medieval imaginations. It wasn't unusual for households to hang bundles of herbs above doorways to ward off hexes or to keep iron tools, like knives, visible in the kitchen as protective talismans. The theory being, witches don't like shiny metal, which honestly feels like an early draft for a terrible horror movie. Even the act of stirring a pot wasn't immune to superstition. Always stir clockwise. Counterclockwise might accidentally summon misfortune, or worse, sour your stew. Nobody wanted demonic soup, but fear of spirits didn't stop at preparation. Mealtime had its own share of rituals. Before eating, many families would make the sign of the cross over their food, not just out of piety, but as a way to purify it from any lurking spiritual contamination. Some lords went a step further, hiring priests to bless entire banquets. An extra layer of insurance in case their enemy's poison plot was backed by dark forces. And if someone fell ill after a meal, well, sometimes the blame fell not on undercooked meat, but on curses, spells, or an ill gaze cast by a jealous neighbor, because it was easier to believe in a curse than admit your cousin forgot to wash his hands before preparing the raw chicken. But not all kitchen superstitions were rooted in fear. Some were meant to attract good fortune. Certain breads were shaped in elaborate patterns to bring prosperity. Specific herbs were added not just for flavor, but for luck, fertility, or protection during childbirth. Even the direction you placed your loaf on the table might influence the family's fortunes. And then, of course, there were the festivals. Feast days often involved symbolic foods meant to honor saints, protect livestock, or ensure a good harvest. Pies shaped like suns, breads decorated with crosses, or cakes baked with tiny, hidden charms inside, all served to invite blessings, and sometimes dental emergencies. In many ways, medieval cooking was as much spiritual warfare as it was culinary art. Every ingredient carried meaning. Every meal was a tiny ritual. Because when you live in a world where disease strikes without warning, crops fail unexpectedly, and medicine involves leeches, well, adding a pinch of superstition to your recipe feels like a small price to pay. But, of course, not all dangers were invisible. Sometimes the threat came from very real, very spoiled food, And that's where we're heading next, into the wild world of medieval foodborne illnesses, where your biggest enemy wasn't the witch outside your window, but the mold inside your bread. Stay tuned. It's about to get surprisingly scientific. If you've ever complained about getting mild food poisoning from a questionable gas station burrito, congratulations. You would not have survived the Middle Ages, because back then, foodborne illness wasn't just an occasional inconvenience. It was part of the dining experience. Let's start with bread, the literal daily bread. It was everywhere, at every meal, for rich and poor alike. But here's the problem. Medieval grain storage was, let's call it ambitious. Grain was often kept in damp, poorly ventilated barns where mold, rodents, and insects held regular social gatherings. Enter ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye. It produces toxic alkaloids that, when baked into bread, can cause ergotism, also charmingly known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms? Convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, gangrene, and, if you were particularly unlucky, death. So, yes, people were literally tripping on bad rye centuries before anyone thought of recreational drugs. Entire villages could fall victim to accidental mass poisoning because of one bad harvest. And no, nobody had a handy little test strip to check their flour. You ate the bread and hoped for the best. Meat wasn't much safer. Without refrigeration, preservation methods were limited to salting, smoking, or drying, none of which guaranteed success. Spoiled meat could harbor parasites, bacteria, or delightful little organisms like Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism, a potentially fatal paralysis that begins by politely shutting down your breathing. Fish? An absolute gamble. Salted cod, pickled herring, or dried eels might sound exotic today, but in the 14th century it was often eat quickly and hope. If it smelled a bit off, well, just add more spices and wine. Milk and dairy weren't much better. Unpasteurized milk spoiled fast, sometimes within hours, especially in warmer months. Spoiled milk turned into accidental cheese or horrifying sludge, depending on how nature felt that day. Listeria, salmonella, and brucellosis were frequent uninvited guests at the breakfast table. And then there were the delightful parasites. Tapeworms, roundworms, and liver flukes often made surprise appearances in undercooked pork and contaminated water. The idea of gut health wasn't exactly trending, unless you count the priest performing last rites as part of the wellness industry. Even fruits and vegetables weren't entirely safe. Contaminated irrigation, unwashed produce, and manure-based fertilizers meant that biting into a juicy apple might also introduce you to dysentery. Water itself was, frankly, dangerous. Streams were often shared by livestock, bathers, and waste disposal. Many medieval towns simply dumped sewage directly into the nearest river. And yet, people kept drinking from it, usually out of desperation. This is why ale and wine were so popular, not because everyone wanted to be perpetually tipsy, though many were, but because fermentation killed enough bacteria to make it the safer option. Even children drank weak ale regularly. It was safer than water, and frankly, by age 6, most medieval kids probably needed a drink anyway. But here's the strange part. Despite all these risks, people still managed to survive. Somehow, their immune systems were battle-hardened, their gut flora legendary. And in many ways, they lived by one golden rule. If it smells okay, eat it. If it smells a little weird, add more spices. If it smells truly awful, feed it to the pigs. Of course, none of this meant life expectancy was great. But compared to dying of plague, starvation, or being trampled by a runaway ox cart, a bit of food poisoning felt almost manageable. And speaking of alcohol, let's talk about that next. Because while modern wellness gurus push detox teas and alkaline water, medieval folks were busy drinking beer for breakfast, and somehow calling it healthcare. Stay with me. The medieval beverage menu is coming up. Let's get one thing clear. Medieval folks weren't alcoholics. They were simply hydrated. Because when your water supply doubles as a public bath, a livestock crossing, and the town's primary sewage system, you start looking for alternative beverages. Enter ale, the real MVP of medieval hydration. Unlike modern beer, which can turn grown adults into craft brew snobs arguing over hop percentages, medieval ale was simple, mild, and frankly, everywhere. It was brewed at home, in monasteries, and in local taverns. It was consumed by everyone, men, women, children, from dawn to dusk. Yes, even children drank ale. Before you clutch your pearls, remember, medieval ale wasn't the potent IPA you're picturing. It was often called small beer, containing just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to get you tipsy after breakfast. Think of it as slightly alcoholic, room temperature liquid bread. In fact, ale brewing was so common that many households treated it like cooking. You made a batch every few days, drank it quickly before it spoiled, and repeated the process endlessly. Monasteries, however, elevated ale-making into an art form. Monks brewed stronger, more refined batches that attracted thirsty travelers and generated hefty profits. In many ways, monks were the original craft brewers, minus the ironic beards and Instagram reels. But ale wasn't the only option. For those with fancier tastes, or larger wallets, there was wine. In southern Europe, where vineyards thrived, wine flowed freely. But for northern regions, importing wine became a lucrative trade and a great way to show off your wealth. A noble's wine cellar was as much a status symbol as his armor or land holdings. And let's not forget mead, that sweet, honey-based beverage beloved by both peasants and kings. Mead was the medieval version of artisanal small batch, labor-intensive, expensive, and often reserved for special occasions or weddings. It was also dangerously easy to drink in large quantities. After a few goblets of mead, most people were one bad decision away from spontaneous sword fights or highly regrettable marriage proposals. Of course, there were downsides to all this drinking. Liver problems? Probably. Hangovers? Absolutely. Drunken duels? Regularly scheduled. But in their defense, what were the alternatives? Drink the water and risk dysentery? Not exactly tempting. Even the church recognized alcohol's role in daily life, as long as you kept it within moderate limits. Although, judging by some records, medieval definitions of moderation were flexible. Interestingly, alcohol also played a role in medicine. Doctors, or whatever passed for doctors, prescribed wine, ale, or mead for a variety of ailments: digestive issues, melancholy, plague prevention, childbirth pains, sometimes all at once, because if nothing else, a mildly drunk patient complained a lot less. But beyond hydration and healthcare, alcohol was also deeply social. Taverns served as meeting places, gossip hubs, and impromptu debate clubs. Deals were made, arguments were settled, songs were sung, all over endless mugs of ale. In many ways, the medieval tavern was the Facebook of its time, except with fewer conspiracy theories and slightly more fistfights. But as we sip our way through this liquid history, it's worth remembering that for all its flaws, medieval drinking culture helped people survive. And occasionally it helped them forget just how many other things were trying to kill them. But while people drank heavily, they also developed surprisingly advanced food preservation techniques. Because when your life depends on whether your meat stays edible through winter, you get creative. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Prepare to meet the surprisingly sophisticated and sometimes bizarre world of medieval food preservation. Stay with me. The pickling is about to begin. If you've ever panicked because your fridge stopped working for 2 hours, congratulations. You would not have survived the winter in medieval Europe, because back then, food preservation wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life and very uncomfortable death. No refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum-sealed containers. Just you, nature, and whatever creative methods your ancestors could come up with to keep meat from turning into a science experiment. Let's start with salt, the undisputed king of medieval preservation. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was currency. Entire towns built their economies around mining, trading, and hoarding salt. And for good reason. Salt drying meat and fish removed moisture, which slowed bacterial growth and made food last for months. Of course, it also turned your dinner into something resembling jerky that might chip a tooth if you weren't careful. Cod, herring, and pork were especially popular for salting. Salted cod was traded across entire continents, so much so that even distant landlocked villages might have barrels of salted fish arriving from far-off coasts. And yes, by the time it reached your plate, it tasted, let's say, distinctive. Next up, smoking. Smoking meat added another layer of protection. The smoke's chemicals helped preserve the flesh while adding flavor. The medieval version of hickory BBQ, but with far less Instagrammable results. Smokehouses dotted the countryside. If your village smelled vaguely like burning oak all year round, that was probably a good thing. Then there was drying. Fruits, herbs, grains, even strips of meat were hung up in warm, dry places to dehydrate naturally. Think of it as early air-drying technology, powered entirely by weather and crossed fingers. Dried apples, plums, and figs became vital winter snacks. They weren't exactly candy, but they didn't rot, and that was good enough. Pickling was another lifesaver. Vegetables were submerged in brine or vinegar, creating tangy, sour versions that could survive months in storage. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Cucumbers became pickles. Almost anything could be pickled if you were desperate or creative enough. Fermentation, in general, was everywhere. Fermented dairy gave us buttermilk, yogurt, and early cheeses. Fermented grains produced beer and ale. Fermented cabbage. Well, that was mostly gas, but it kept people fed. Honey also played a surprising role. Its natural antibacterial properties made it perfect for preserving fruits, nuts, and even cooked meats. Sealing certain foods in honey kept oxygen out and bacteria at bay. Plus, as a bonus, you got delicious honey-soaked treats months later, assuming no one in your household cracked open the jar early. For the truly wealthy, more exotic preservation methods appeared. Ice houses, literal underground pits packed with winter ice, allowed some aristocrats to keep perishables cool for longer periods. But these were rare luxuries, and most people made do with salted ham hanging from the rafters. And let's not forget storage containers. Clay jars, wooden barrels, animal bladders, and wax-sealed pots all helped keep food sealed and safe, or at least safe enough. Of course, no method was foolproof. Even the best preserved foods sometimes spoiled. When that happened, you either threw it to the pigs, buried it quietly, or, if you were particularly bold, added extra spices and hoped for the best. But make no mistake, these preservation techniques were ingenious adaptations to brutal circumstances. Without them, entire communities would have starved every winter. Because in a world without supermarkets, you either became a master of long-term food storage, or you didn't live long enough to worry about it. And while most people were busy trying not to starve, some had a much sweeter problem to solve: how to get sugar. Because as rare as spices were, sugar was even more exclusive, a luxury so decadent it made gold look cheap. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Prepare to enter the sugary world of medieval desserts, where only the richest got cavities. Stay with me. The sweet course is being served. Let's talk about sugar, the forbidden fruit of medieval Europe. The glittering white powder that was more valuable than gold, more addictive than TikTok, and almost entirely reserved for people who already had too much of everything. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, your idea of dessert probably involved something simple. Maybe a baked apple, maybe a bit of honey, if the bees had been cooperative and nobody else had raided your hives first. But sugar was not for you. It arrived in Europe like a rare treasure, transported across dangerous trade routes from distant lands, India, the Middle East, eventually North Africa, and Sicily. And once it arrived, the price tag was so outrageous that only kings, nobles, and the obscenely rich could afford to sprinkle it on anything. In fact, for much of the Middle Ages, sugar wasn't even thought of as food. It was medicine. Doctors, and we're using that word generously, prescribed sugar for all kinds of ailments: coughs, fevers, digestive issues, melancholy, weak hearts, and pretty much anything else that needed an expensive placebo. A spoonful of sugar didn't just help the medicine go down, it was the medicine. And then, of course, The rich did what the rich always do. They turned it into a status symbol. Banquets began featuring sugar sculptures, elaborate models of castles, animals, mythical creatures, and even entire battle scenes, all painstakingly molded from boiled sugar and marzipan. These weren't desserts. They were edible bragging rights. Imagine your dinner guest walking into the hall and seeing a life-sized sugar swan on the table. That swan didn't just say, "I have money." It screamed it with perfect crystallized feathers. The artistry was astonishing. The absurdity was equally impressive. Sometimes entire armies of sugar knights faced off against each other on the dessert table, while the real knights politely applauded and quietly loosened their belts after 12 courses. But not all sugar creations were purely decorative, for the truly fortunate and wealthy. There were actual desserts, spiced cakes made with almonds, ginger, and saffron, sweet custards flavored with rosewater, candied fruits, painstakingly boiled in honey or syrup for days to preserve them, sugared almonds that served as both dessert and breath freshener after heavy garlicky meals. These treats weren't just food, they were events. Guests savored each bite, not just for the taste, but for the knowledge that they were consuming something their servants would never even see. And yet, even as sugar gradually became more accessible in the late medieval period, it remained mostly a luxury. The average peasant might live their entire life having tasted sugar only once, perhaps at a wedding or festival if they were lucky. And dental hygiene? Let's not even go there. While sugar was rare, toothbrushes were rarer. Medieval dentists, if you can call them that, mostly specialized in removing teeth once they rotted, preferably with minimal screaming. And in fairness, that particular profession hasn't changed as much as we like to think. But sugar wasn't the only sweetener available. Honey was far more common and widely used for centuries before sugar took center stage. It flavored breads, preserved fruits, and sweetened ales. Beekeeping was serious business, and monasteries often controlled large apiaries, making honey both a vital food source and another source of income for the church. And even among peasants, a well-timed raid on a wild beehive could provide enough honey to sweeten porridge or bake simple honey cakes for special occasions. But while honey was accessible, sugar remained aspirational. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a Rolls-Royce while everyone else was still on foot. Still, even the richest feasts couldn't avoid the final reality of all medieval meals. Eventually the food would run out, the candles would burn low, the guests would stumble home, some full, some sick, and some slightly poisoned, depending on the politics of the evening. But before we end our tour of medieval kitchens, we still have a few key players to meet, because behind every extravagant feast stood an army of cooks, servants, tasters, and mysterious kitchen staff, each with their own dangerous, exhausting, and occasionally absurd roles in keeping the dining machine running. And that's where we're headed next. Stay with me. The back of the house is far messier than the banquet hall. When you picture a medieval feast, you probably imagine the grand hall, towering ceilings, long wooden tables, nobles clinking goblets, swan centerpieces silently judging everyone. But none of that glittering spectacle would have been possible without the chaotic, sweaty, and frankly terrifying world hiding behind the kitchen doors. The royal kitchens were less like a peaceful restaurant and more like a small, semi-dysfunctional military operation, one filled with knives, open fires, live animals, and wildly fluctuating levels of food safety. Let's start with the staff. Running a noble kitchen took dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people. At the top stood the master cook, part chef, part manager, part crisis negotiator. His job? Make sure dinner was ready, nothing caught fire, too much, and the food taster didn't dramatically collapse halfway through service. Under him were countless assistants, the spit turners, usually young boys who spent hours slowly rotating entire animals over open flames, permanently smelling like roast meat for the rest of their lives. The butchers, tasked with breaking down entire carcasses into manageable portions without accidentally severing any fingers or royal patience. The bakers, up before dawn, responsible for producing thousands of loaves of bread daily, with ovens so large you could lose a moderately sized goat inside them. The saucières, endlessly stirring pots of thick, heavily spiced gravies designed to hide the occasional oops in meat freshness. The pastry cooks, artists of sugar and dough who somehow managed to sculpt edible castles while dodging flies, mice, and the occasional kitchen cat. And of course, the scullery workers, the unsung heroes who scrubbed cauldrons, washed trenchers, and dealt with the aftermath of culinary disasters. Their reward? Usually a meal of the parts nobody else wanted. The kitchens themselves were architectural nightmares. Massive open fires roared constantly. Cauldrons bubbled ominously. Knives glinted under flickering torchlight. And the floor? A dangerous mixture of grease, bones, vegetable scraps, and the occasional confused chicken running for its life. In winter, the kitchens were freezing except near the fires. In summer, they became sweltering, smoky saunas of human suffering. Fire was, of course, a constant threat. A single stray spark could turn the entire castle kitchen into an extremely well-seasoned bonfire. Then there were the logistics. Royal feasts weren't planned on a whim. Days, sometimes weeks, of preparation went into each event. Livestock had to be slaughtered, fish caught or delivered, often still flopping in barrels, vegetables harvested, herbs gathered, spices weighed, pastries sculpted. All of this while coordinating deliveries from distant markets, adjusting menus for last-minute noble guest lists, and nervously monitoring the royal mood, because one angry monarch could undo weeks of work with a single temper tantrum. Let's not forget about inventory management. Food storage was a delicate science, requiring constant vigilance to prevent spoilage, theft, or rodent invasions. And yes, rats were a daily problem. Some kitchens employed cats specifically to keep the rodent population in check. The cats were not paid, but they were arguably the most popular staff members. Then there were the political landmines. A single kitchen worker caught stealing an extra piece of honey cake could face brutal punishment. Rival factions within the court sometimes tried to plant saboteurs among the staff. And if anyone suspected the kitchen of collaborating in a poisoning plot, things could get very ugly, very fast. But despite the chaos, the pressure, and the horrifying lack of OSHA regulations, the royal kitchens produced astonishing feats of culinary engineering. Multi-course feasts featuring dozens of unique dishes, elaborate sugar sculptures, roasted animals disguised as mythical creatures, dinners that doubled as performance art. And all of it had to be perfect, because in the end, the king and his guests only saw the finished product. The sweating, cursing, occasionally panicking army of cooks remained out of sight, the invisible hands that turned food into politics. But as impressive as these kitchens were, they also reflected a deeper truth about medieval life. Food was never just food. It was survival. It was status. It was danger. It was theater. And nowhere was that more evident than in the strange rituals and dining customs that played out at the noble table itself, where etiquette could be as complex as the menu. Which brings us to our next course, the bizarre, highly choreographed world of medieval dining rituals, where how you ate mattered just as much as what you ate. Stay with me. The rules of the table are about to get very weird. Eating in medieval Europe wasn't just a physical act, it was a performance, a carefully choreographed ballet of rules, customs, and unspoken threats. Because while peasants could slurp their cabbage stew in peace, nobles ate under the constant gaze of everyone in the room, their lords, their rivals, and occasionally a visiting ambassador ready to judge their entire kingdom based on how gracefully they handled a chicken leg. Let's begin with seating. The original medieval seating chart could make or break your career. Where you sat wasn't random. The king sat at the high table, elevated above everyone, quite literally looking down on his guests. The closer you sat to him, the more important you were. Get placed near the salt? Congratulations, you were somebody. Stuck way down by the kitchen door, where the dogs lurked and the draft blew? Better start writing those political apology letters. The phrase above the salt comes directly from this arrangement. Salt was expensive and placed in the middle of the high table. The VIPs sat above it, the less fortunate below. Once seated, the real fun began. The rules of eating. For starters, medieval diners rarely ate with individual plates. Instead, they shared a trencher, a thick, stale slab of bread that served as both plate and sponge. Food was ladled onto the trencher, and you ate directly from it. When the meal ended, the trencher, now soaked in gravy, sauces, and crumbs, was often given to the poor, the servants, or even tossed to dogs. Sharing a trencher was a matter of trust. You didn't get assigned one randomly. You shared with someone of equal or lesser rank. Sharing with the wrong person could be seen as an insult, or worse, a political statement. Utensils? Mostly optional. Knives were personal. You brought your own. Forks existed, but were rare in much of Europe until centuries later. Many diners simply used their fingers, which meant proper hand washing became not just hygiene, but etiquette. And yes, you were expected to wash your hands before and after meals, sometimes multiple times, often with great ceremony. Hand-washing bowls were passed around, accompanied by servants with towels, and sometimes even scented waters to mask the smell of whatever dubious meat you were about to consume. Conversation at the table was another minefield. Talking too much? Rude. Talking too little? Suspicious. Speaking while chewing? Absolutely forbidden. And don't even think about reaching across someone else's trencher for that extra piece of peacock, unless you wanted to start a duel over dinner. Portion control was also heavily monitored. You were expected to take only what was offered, not help yourself. Greed was seen as a sign of poor breeding, and overeating, though rampant, was something one pretended not to do. Belching? Depends where you were. In some regions, a polite burp showed appreciation. In others, it might earn you a sharp look from a scandalized bishop. Toasts were serious business. You didn't simply raise your cup. You made eye contact. You spoke your blessing or wish. You drank carefully, because you never knew who was watching or who might have slipped something extra into your goblet. Some even clinked cups gently, not for the sound, but as a way to symbolically mix the drinks and prove no poison had been added. Entertainment during these meals ranged from musicians and jesters to full-blown plays, animal performances, and, on very special occasions, live jousting right outside the hall, because apparently digesting several pounds of roasted boar wasn't exciting enough on its own. And hovering over everything was the constant pressure of appearance. You didn't just eat. You displayed your breeding, your rank, your self-control. One wrong move, a spilled goblet, a clumsy grab for bread, an unfortunate sneeze, could be remembered for years, weaponized by rivals, and whispered about in court corridors. Because in medieval politics, even dinner was dangerous. But beyond the rigid etiquette and high-stakes dining games, these meals also served a deeper purpose. They were about unity, loyalty, and the subtle balancing act of power. To eat together was to reaffirm alliances. To refuse an invitation was to risk offense. To survive the meal without scandal, a quiet victory. And yet, for all their pomp and danger, these feasts left a surprising legacy. Because some of the dishes, customs, and even phrases from these medieval banquets have survived in strange, sometimes unrecognizable forms, all the way into modern times. And that's where we'll finish our journey, the surprisingly familiar echoes of medieval dining that still live in our kitchens today. Stay with me. The final course is about to be served. After wandering through the smoky kitchens, the poisoned goblets, the questionable fish barrels, and the sugar swans, you might be tempted to think, thank goodness all of that is behind us. But not entirely. Because, surprisingly, bits and pieces of medieval dining still linger quietly in our modern world, like culinary ghosts politely haunting your dinner plate. Let's start with bread. The humble loaf remains at the heart of many meals. The term breaking bread as a sign of friendship? That's medieval. So is the tradition of sharing bread as part of a peace offering or a family meal. Even our word companion comes from the Latin companus, literally one who shares bread. And while we no longer serve food directly on stale bread trenchers, the concept of edible plates lives on in things like taco bowls, bread bowls, and other Instagrammable inventions. Salt still carries its old symbolic weight. Being worth your salt, or above the salt, directly traces back to medieval seating hierarchies. And though we now take salt for granted, its historical role as a precious commodity shaped economies and even built cities. Preserved foods, we owe much to medieval survival tactics. Cured meats, pickles, jams, smoked salmon, all rooted in methods perfected by people who simply wanted to not starve through winter. Even your cheese board carries echoes of monks experimenting with fermentation in drafty stone cellars centuries ago. Spices, too, remain central to our global palate. Once worth more than gold, they now sit humbly in your kitchen cabinet, mass-produced and readily available, a quiet testament to the trade routes, wars, and empires they once fueled. And yes, the very idea of a multi-course meal came from medieval feasts. Starter, main, dessert. That structured progression was formalized around long royal banquets, where pacing the meal wasn't just polite, but strategic, allowing both digestion and political maneuvering. Even our modern obsession with culinary presentation echoes those elaborate sugar sculptures and peacock centerpieces. We may no longer reattach feathers to roasted birds, thankfully, but the art of eating with the eyes remains alive and well. And then there's alcohol. The craft beer movement. Monks were doing it centuries ago. Mead tastings, medieval. Wine pairings, also medieval. And while we've upgraded sanitation standards, mostly, the core idea of drinking socially, ceremonially, and for mild health reasons remains remarkably familiar. Even some medieval superstitions have subtly survived. The tradition of toasting before drinking. Originally, it served both to honor the company and, depending on who you ask, to prove the wine wasn't poisoned. The custom of clinking glasses, some believe it symbolically mixed drinks as an act of trust. And then there's language. Eat, drink, and be merry. A toast to your health. Breaking bread together. These phrases carry whispers of medieval halls, flickering torchlight, and long wooden tables. Of course, not everything endured. We've largely abandoned fermented fish buried underground, boiled eels for breakfast, and blood pancakes, though somewhere a daring food blogger is probably trying to bring them back, ironically. And mercifully, modern chefs are no longer required to employ food tasters, unless you count your friend who insists on sampling your cooking before anyone else does. But perhaps the greatest legacy of medieval dining isn't in the dishes or even the etiquette. It's in the simple, universal truth that meals, then as now, were never just about food. They were about gathering, about alliances, about family, about survival, and sometimes about flexing your wealth by casually presenting an edible unicorn at dessert. So the next time you sit down to eat, whether it's a humble sandwich or an extravagant feast, take a moment to appreciate the long, strange journey that brought food from those smoky medieval kitchens to your plate. And maybe, quietly, be grateful that your dinner probably won't try to kill you, at least not intentionally. Sleep well. Let's play a little game, shall we? Imagine you wake up one morning in medieval Europe. The birds are chirping. The distant church bell is ringing. Your stomach, growling. Breakfast time. But here's the catch. You're not grabbing your oat milk latte and a croissant from your favorite overpriced coffee shop. No, you're about to face the beautiful, slightly horrifying, and occasionally fatal world of medieval food. A world where chefs doubled as poison testers. Where dinner could be anything from a hearty stew to, well, fermented shark. Where the concept of organic was less a trendy hashtag and more a desperate hope that your bread wasn't secretly made of sawdust. See, back then, food wasn't just something you casually Instagram before taking your first bite. Food was power. Food was status. Food was, sometimes, a terrifying gamble with your intestines. Royal banquets could easily double as episodes of Game of Thrones. Peasants? They were just hoping their porridge didn't come with extra protein in the form of weevils. And let's not forget the accidental food poisoning that swept entire towns like a medieval version of bad Yelp reviews. In today's journey, we'll gently stroll, at a very safe distance, through the bizarre, hilarious, and occasionally disturbing culinary landscape of the Middle Ages. We'll explore why nobles ate things that would make Gordon Ramsay cry, why peasants basically invented farm-to-table centuries before it was cool, and why spices were basically more valuable than Bitcoin. Yes, seriously. So grab your wooden spoon, maybe hold your breath, and let's dine like it's 1347. Just maybe avoid the oysters. Let's set the table, quite literally. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food, it was a billboard, a flex, a loud, edible statement screaming, "Look at me, I'm rich, important, and probably have better digestion than you." Every single meal was an opportunity to show off, especially if you were part of the upper crust, which coincidentally was also the only part of the bread nobles bothered to eat. They left the stale, rock-hard bottom to the peasants. How thoughtful. For kings, dukes, and wealthy merchants, hosting a feast was basically the medieval version of throwing a yacht party in Monaco. Except instead of champagne, you had honey mead. And instead of a private DJ, you had a half-drunk bard playing the lute, while a jester tried very hard not to get executed for a bad joke. But while the music played and the meat roasted, there was always an underlying tension. Because in medieval dining, danger lurked under every silver platter. Food could be a weapon. Rivals slipped poisons into goblets. Ambitious courtiers plotted over platters of stuffed swan. And if you were the host, well, better have a royal food taster handy, preferably one you didn't like very much. You see, in an era where personal hygiene was, let's politely say, experimental, even a properly cooked meal could turn on you. Undercooked meat? That's a surprise invitation to medieval salmonella. Unpasteurized milk? Hope you enjoy several hours of intestinal regret. Moldy bread? Congratulations, you may have just invented LSD. Accidentally. Of course, none of this really bothered the nobles. Why? Because if they got sick, they simply summoned a physician who might bleed them or suggest leeches. Problem solved. Or, more accurately, problem multiplied. Meanwhile, the poor, they didn't worry about poison. They couldn't afford food fancy enough to be poisoned. Their main concern was simply getting enough of it. Barley gruel, cabbage soup, occasional scraps of cheese if the local lord was feeling generous or distracted. Meat, a rare holiday miracle. For the peasantry, every meal was essentially a delicate negotiation between survival and scurvy. But don't feel too sorry for them just yet, because while the nobles played their high-stakes dinner games, the peasants were accidentally living closer to what we now call a whole foods, plant-based diet. Ironically, that barley gruel might have been better for you than half the monstrosities served at the king's table. No offense to the roasted peacock enthusiasts, but we're just getting started, because if you think strange birds and questionable bread were the worst of it, oh no. The medieval menu has plenty more surprises. Up next, what did the peasants actually eat? And how many ways can you cook barley before losing your will to live? Stay with me.